Chapter 106 to 108. As Gilgamesh unleashed all of his noble phantasms, he was able to single-handedly hold back the army of heroic spirits for a brief moment. Someone has betrayed Alaya. Who is it? I don't know, but he won't last long. Anyone who goes against Alaya is bound to be captured and brought back soon enough. As Arjuna prepared to take aim at Gilgamesh, a divine spear appeared before him. Arjuna turned his head to see Karna standing calmly nearby. Do you wish to challenge me here? Karna shook his head. That person is imbued with the power of Alaya, so go easy on him. But isn't Alaya bringing us here to kill those who trespass? Arjuna inquired. Let the monsters of Gaia handle what needs to be done. Can't you see that the others are holding back too? Karna replied. After considering Karna's words, Arjuna lowered his bow. Despite calculating the time in his mind, Shirou struggled against both the army of heroic spirits and the monsters of Gaia. However, what left him feeling hopeless was the realization that there seemed to be no way out. 86 400 seconds, 17 800 seconds, counting, running, resisting, struggling to survive. And then feeling disappointed. Despite the disappointment, he refused to give up. His heart was no longer clouded by doubt. Though he might be disappointed, he refused to despair. He ran tirelessly, searching for an exit that didn't exist. As time ticked away, Shirou found his magical energy reserves rapidly dwindling as he confronted both the monsters of Gaia and the army of heroic spirits of Alaya. The monsters of Gaia were particularly dangerous, and Shirou had to activate his mana burst to stand a chance against them. The evil flowers were able to absorb malice from the heroic spirits to restore magical energy. But the rate of restoration was far slower than the rate of depletion. As a result, all the energy was eventually used up. Shirou constantly attacked and defended, repairing his wounds whenever he could. Despite his efforts, his magical energy was eventually depleted, leaving him unable to move. Even Archaeid, who had been assisting him, suffered from heavy consumption, and eventually Marble Phantasm became difficult to operate. Shirou was covered in wounds and had a tired expression on his face, but despite his injuries, his eyes remained bright. He had not given up hope. He had just been pierced through the back by a monster modeled after the Hellhound, created by Gaia. Blood dripped slowly from the wound as he struggled to breathe. He tried to use his black mud to repair the wound, but without magical energy, it was no longer effective. Even moving was now difficult for him. But despite his injuries, Shirou's eyes remained bright, showing that he had not given up hope. He was still searching for an exit. All of his hard work finally paid off when Shirou spotted a broken passage in the distance, emitting the aura of the real world. It was undoubtedly the passage connecting to the real world and the way out of this place. Go, Archaeid! The exit is that way, Shirou gasped, his exhaustion apparent on his face as he gestured towards the passage. Archaeid carried Shirou over her shoulder as they made their way towards the passage. You're not Roa, she stated with a serious tone. With a pale face, Shirou managed a faint smile. So, you've finally figured it out. The reason you're not Roa isn't that you're not his reincarnation, but because your mud consumed Roa. I see. I'm not sure why that happened, he said with a smile. Once we're out of here, you'll have to fill me in on all the details. Okay, she nodded, her expression serious. As Shirou and Archaeid made their way towards the passage, they were suddenly surrounded by the monsters of Gaia and the army of heroic spirits from Alaya. Countless light pillars were flashing in front of the passage, pulling out heroes and monsters alike with the power of the two major counterforces. Archaeid had to come to a stop, her face now heavy with worry. Shirou managed a smile, saying, "It seems that this is the final battle." With great effort, he forced his weak body to stand up. Despite the exhaustion all over his face, he projected a sword and shot it towards the heroic spirit in front of him. Clang! As expected, the sword was easily cut in half by the heroic spirit. Shirou gasped weakly, attempting to project another sword, but she stopped him. "Do you still want to fight?" she asked. "Of course! If I give up on myself, that would be true defeat," Shirou said with a smile. Arcade stared at him with a blank expression before replying in a serious tone. "I'll make sure you live through this no matter what." She then took hold of Shirou's hand. "What are you doing?" Shirou asked, bewildered. Arcade didn't answer, but instead leaned in and kissed Shirou's bloodied arm. A warm, moist sensation spread across his skin as her soft tongue gently licked his wound. Shirou barely had time to process the romantic sensation before he asked in shock, "Are you drinking my blood? Do you want to unleash your vampiric impulse?" Shirou started to ask, but before he could finish, an overwhelmingly terrifying frenzy burst forth from Arcueid's body. Arcueid lifted her head slowly, and her previously red eyes now gleamed gold. Her gaze was cold and greedy, fixed upon Shirou as if he were nothing more than a piece of food. It was clear that this was the true form of Arcueid, the princess of the true ancestors, as she unleashed her vampiric impulse, revealing the full extent of her power. Arcade struggled to maintain control of her reason and forced a smile as she addressed Shirou. "I'm sorry for chasing you like you were Roa. Next time we meet, I promise to apologize properly," Shirou asked. "Do you want to fight alone?" But she remained silent, having already transformed into her true ancestor form. Her vampiric impulse had been fully unleashed, causing her to resemble Crimson Moon in power. Despite the constant torment of her terrifying impulse, which urged her to treat Shirou like a blood bag and drain him completely, Arcade managed to resist its pull. Instead, she directed her hostility towards the army of heroic spirits and monsters of Gaia that lay before her. With Shirou in her grip, she let out a deafening shout and charged forward, her movements reminiscent of a demon king seeking to obliterate the world. Her claws were sharp as swords, slicing through the air with a flash of crimson light. Arcade moved effortlessly through her surroundings, swiftly dispatching any Gaia monsters or heroic spirits that dared to cross her path. And when faced with an army of heroic spirits in the distance, swarming like ants, she called forth a shrunken moon and hurled it towards them. This was Arcade's strongest inherited attack from Crimson Moon, a miniature version of the Moonfall. The shrunken moon fell upon the army of heroic spirits, crushing them like small satellites and obliterating any heroic spirits or Gaia monsters that stood in its path. This was the true terror of Arcade, standing atop the Nasuverse. She was capable of punching gods and kicking islands with a level of destructive power that approached the UO level. But this was only a fraction of her true strength, as Gaia had refused to support her. If she were able to access her Princess Arc mode, she would truly become the strongest form. Even so, Arcade was already among the most powerful beings in existence. Unfortunately, she could not sustain this level of power for too long, lest she be consumed by her vampiric impulses and become nothing more than a vessel for Crimson Moon. To prevent this, Arcade limited herself to using only 30% of her power, while the remaining 70% was used to suppress her impulses. However, in order to help Shirou escape, she was forced to unlock her vampiric impulses, unleashing a barrage of attacks with a deafening impact. Boom, 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 boom! Arcade, with what remained of her sanity, led Shirou towards the escape route and forcibly shoved him into the fissure. "You're coming in too, Arcade!" Shirou cried out in desperation. The fissure in the real world continued to shrink, as if attempting to repair itself and vanish at any moment. Arcade struggled to suppress her vampiric urges and follow Shirou, but she was suddenly knocked down by a monster. Shirou struggled to climb out of the fissure, but a hand pushed him back down. "Next time we meet, you have to teach me how to play Go." The girl's candid yet silly voice echoed in Shirou's ears as she went berserk and charged toward the monster group. Shirou was completely pushed out of the hole. The rain beat down heavily upon the forest as Shirou was hurled out of the void's hole and landed on the muddy ground below. Crack, crack, crack. The void's hole was restored as if nothing had occurred in the first place. Shirou crawled forward, his clothes drenched from the rainfall and the muddy terrain. 3 claw marks from Gaia monsters had left black and red blood oozing from his back, trickling down his skin and staining the muddy ground below. Drip, drip. The black mud swirled near the wound as if attempting to repair it, but the scarce amount of magical energy left in Shirou's body was insufficient to activate the mud's power. Escaping from the root was already an immense stroke of luck, and running out of magical energy can be viewed as the lightest of costs. Yet, this came at the expense of Arcuid's sacrifice. It seemed that nothing had truly changed. When compared to the real world, he was still a weakling. What could a weakling possibly achieve? No. Even a weakling can achieve something and bring about change. At the very least, he couldn't die here. The significance of the battle lay not solely in its outcome, but to be able to smile once more and reunite with those who mattered most. Stay alive. Stay alive. Then he must find her and return home to his family. He still had his birthday to celebrate. So, Shirou strained to lift his head, his ears picking up the sound of footsteps. Blood flowed from the wound on his forehead and dripped into his eyes, but he could still make out a figure approaching him. It was a girl with long black hair, accompanied by her entourage. She seemed to be saying something in a language he couldn't comprehend. But he could absorb evil from these people. The evil flower continued to activate, and sensing the malevolence within the humans, the black mud began to absorb it. With little magical energy remaining in his body, Shirou felt the black mud start to mend his wounds. "Thank you," Shirou muttered before losing consciousness. "Ugh." Shirou groaned and slowly opened his eyes, feeling aches pulsating through his head and abdomen. Had he not escaped the path to the root yet? As he sat up, his whole body screamed in soreness. He muttered to himself, attempting to shake off the disorientation, but froze when he realized he was not in the familiar environment he had expected. Standing up and nervously looking around, his brow furrowed. Where was this? It was a strange place, or perhaps it was better to call it a room. Shirou scanned the room, taking note of the deep cracks that covered the walls. He could feel a cold wind blowing in from outside, and as he looked up slightly, he saw a huge hole in the ceiling that let in a thin stream of sunlight. Was this a thatched hut? Suddenly, his nose detected a damp and slightly putrid odor emanating from the corner of the room. He turned his head and saw a pile of grass, which made him swallow hard and his face become slightly unnatural. The walls were made of mud and rubble and weeds were strewn in the corners. As Shirou looked down, he realized that he was lying on something. He reached out and touched it, trying to determine what it was. Could it be a straw? Where had he been thrown into? Chatter, chatter. From outside, a graceful figure walked slowly into the room, a girl wearing a brown dress adorned with silver scales that shone with elegance and nobility, a stark contrast to the dilapidated surroundings. She wiped the sweat from her forehead and looked at Shirou, her eyes curious. "Chatter, chatter." Her voice was soft and melodic as she spoke, but all he could hear was a jumble of nonsensical words. Shirou. He didn't understand what the girl was saying, but the unfamiliar situation triggered an instinctive sense of wariness within him. He carefully scrutinized the girl, searching for any clues about her intentions. She appeared to be around 14 years old, with a beautiful, youthful face that was framed by long, lustrous black hair. Her locks cascaded down her back in waves, lending her an air of elegance and grace. Her bright blue eyes seemed to mirror Shirou's own appearance, sparkling with intelligence and curiosity. But that wasn't the most striking thing. The girl's face bore an uncanny resemblance to his own. A distant cousin, perhaps? But he couldn't recall his parents ever mentioning having a relative with such a striking resemblance. And then there was that dreamlike dress. No one besides actors in stage plays and TV dramas should be wearing something like that, right? As the girl continued speaking, she reached out to touch Shirou's cheek. Instinctively, he grasped her wrist and asked, "Excuse me, but who are you, and where am I?" Despite his grip on her wrist, the girl seemed surprisingly calm. Her expression was warm, with a hint of doubt. However, as soon as he spoke, the girl's demeanor suddenly changed. Her delicate face contorted with fear, and her eyes flickered with terror, as though she had been caught by some kind of monster. She struggled to free her hand, and then shouted in a panicked voice. Shirou gazed at her with a bewildered expression, completely at a loss. He couldn't make sense of anything that was happening. Suddenly, several heavy male voices were heard outside the door, followed by the clamor of armored soldiers rushing in, pulling out their swords and pointing them at Shirou. The girl quickly took cover behind the soldiers, her eyes wide with fear as she peered out at him. Shirou. He couldn't comprehend what these people were saying in a language he didn't understand. However, from their aggressive gestures and the girl's fearful reaction, it was apparent that he had somehow offended her, and the soldiers were now pointing their swords at him. In that brief and incomprehensible encounter, Shirou learned three things. Firstly, he realized that he had no idea where he had ended up after escaping from the Root. It certainly couldn't be modern times, since nobody besides actors and cosplayers wears silver armor and brandishes swords these days. Times have changed, and even magi resort to using guns. Secondly, the language barrier made it impossible for him to communicate with them. Lastly, he observed that whenever he spoke, these people became frightened and filled with a mix of fear, hatred, and anger. Shirou was able to perceive these emotions so clearly because his evil flower had absorbed the negative emotions of these people. Chatter, chatter, chatter. Several soldiers shouted at Shirou, but received no response. Fury flickered in their eyes as they gripped their swords and advanced toward him. However, as they drew closer, Shirou's black mud surged forth, and two thin hands extended to shatter their swords into pieces. The soldiers' faces turned pale, and they took a few steps back in fear. The girl crouched down and trembled, clutching her head in terror. Just then, another panicked soldier rushed in. After a brief exchange of chatter, the soldiers turned ashen and fled with the girl, galloping away on their horses until they were no longer visible to him. Shirou surveyed his surroundings in confusion, struggling to make sense of what had just happened. As he stepped outside, his eyes furrowed at the sight of the towering trees and dilapidated houses in the village ruins. Despite the decay, he noticed the remnants of beautiful brick and tile fragments scattered about, suggesting that this place had once been a beautiful and flourishing village. At that moment, he felt his evil flower greedily absorbing a large amount of negative energy, which gradually transformed into magical energy, nourishing him with its power. As the magical energy flowed into his body, his depleted energy began to recover, and the black mud within him stirred and writhed with renewed vigor. Swoosh! In the distance, a flock of birds suddenly took flight from the forest, their startled squawks echoing through the air. They were quickly followed by a group of wyverns, their massive wings propelling them up toward the sky with powerful flaps as they let out fierce howls that reverberated through the forest. Clip, clop, clip, clop! The sound of hooves echoed through the jungle, catching Shirou's attention. He turned his head and saw a cavalry charging towards him from within the trees. The leader, holding a long spear, shouted something that Shirou couldn't quite make out at first. Chatter, chatter, Guinevere! The leader bellowed, his voice carrying over the noise of the charging horses. Guinevere! The cavalry's hostile yells rang out as they charged toward Shirou with animosity in their eyes. Meanwhile, the wyverns soaring above them let out loud roars and quickly joined the attack, hurtling toward Shirou with incredible speed. Shirou turned and broke into a run, his heart pounding with confusion. He was still unsure of his location and what was happening around him, but the hostility of the soldiers charging toward him was all too clear. His body was weak and tired, drained of magical energy and willpower. The surreal sight of armed soldiers on horseback and mighty wyverns soaring through the sky only added to his confusion. As he fled, Shirou commanded his accumulated evil to manifest 2 human-sized black hands on his back. He then used the black mud to form a black bow and a quiver of black arrows. Taking aim at one of the flying wyverns, he shot an arrow and hit the creature, cursing it with his evil. The wyvern let out a loud cry as it fell to the ground. Seizing the opportunity amidst the chaos, Shirou summoned a pair of wings and took to the air, eager to put as much distance as possible between himself and the enemies. However, what troubled Shirou the most was that the knight relentlessly pursued him for miles, shouting Guinevere at the top of his lungs. The bipedal wyverns followed closely behind, their iron mounts propelling them forward at breakneck speeds. As the evil energy he had absorbed from the girl and her soldiers began to dwindle, he was forced to temporarily disable his wings and land on the ground, running on foot. But how could his legs match the speed of the cavalry? It wasn't long before he was caught up to. Sighing heavily, Shirou turned to face the approaching cavalry, knowing that he had no other choice. He considered his options and decided that perhaps by using the power of the evil flower to absorb their evil emotions and convert them into autonomous protection that was more mana efficient, and by utilizing his projection, he might be able to put up a fight. But he knew that this kind of attack might not be effective against the bipedal wyverns who loomed on the horizon. Shirou hesitated for a moment, knowing that not fighting would be like giving up his chance. He steeled himself, preparing to attack with a renewed determination. But suddenly, everything changed. A figure leapt high into the air with a swift whoosh, brandishing a sharp sword that glinted in the sunlight with a cold, deadly light. With a resounding crack, the blade sliced through the air, and a bipedal wyvern was cleaved in two, its body plummeting to the ground. The sharp storm of the rising sword broke several trees around them, and the overwhelming sight before their eyes forced the cavalry to come to a sudden stop. Even the bipedal wyverns in the sky instinctively halted in their tracks. An old knight with a weathered face placed his giant sword on the ground, the impact causing the horses on the opposite side to take a few uneasy steps back. Shirou was stunned, hardly able to believe what had just happened. Was he saved? Suddenly, a hand reached out from behind and patted his shoulder. Shirou turned around and was surprised to see a blonde girl dressed as a boy looking at him with a pair of bright blue eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, but all Shirou could hear were unintelligible sounds. "Chatter, chatter, chatter," she said, leaving Shirou completely confused. Beside the girl, a boy stood with his arms crossed, holding a piece of grass in his mouth. His eyes drooped with an air of aloofness that made him seem difficult to get along with. The cavalry on the other side seemed to know the old knight, and they were clearly afraid of him. They only shouted for a moment before turning and leaving, pointing angrily at Shirou and shouting, "Guinevere!" The old knight turned around and looked at Shirou, making some unintelligible sounds as if asking something. Shirou remained silent, still unsure of what to do or say. He was afraid that speaking might lead to hostility, just like it had with the black-haired girl before. Although it was not certain that this old knight would show hostility like the black-haired girl, Shirou knew that the old knight's strength was very strong. Before he could recover his mana, Shirou didn't want to risk even the slightest possibility of fighting with the old knight. Seeing that Shirou remained silent, The old knight frowned and said something to the blonde girl and the boy before turning and walking away. The boy with the grass in his mouth gave Shirou a quick glance before turning to leave, while the blonde girl patted Shirou's shoulder and spoke in her unintelligible language, motioning for Shirou to follow her. After thinking for a moment, he decided to follow the girl. As they walked, Shirou took in his surroundings, growing increasingly familiar with the environment. He couldn't help but steal glances at the blonde girl's face, sensing that he recognized her. However, something felt off about her pair of blue eyes, as if something important was missing. Sunlight filtered through the mottled leaves, casting fragmented rays of light onto the forest floor. Leaves drifted down from the branches, creating small ripples as they landed on the water's surface. Furrowing his brow, Shirou followed the trio as they weaved their way through the forest. The sunlight filtered through the thin window curtains, casting a faint golden ripple onto the bed. Shirou twitched his eyebrows and woke up, as he did every morning. He got off the hard bed, put on the gray linen clothes that hung on the side, and then pulled open the coarse cloth curtains to let sunlight shine into the simple room. Standing in front of the window, Shirou surveyed the familiar surroundings. This was a manor. Clatter, clatter, clatter! A blonde girl in silver armor slowly walked into the manor, leading a horse. Shirou went over the words and grammar in his head and greeted her in a language he was not familiar with. "Good morning, Artoria. You're back from patrolling the town?" Artoria turned to look at Shirou, nodding her head. Good morning, Guinevere." So Shirou showed a troubled expression and said, "I've told you, please call me Fujimaru Shirou." "Okay?" She nodded seriously before making a very effortful expression, her snowy white face turning red as she struggled to pronounce the unfamiliar name. After a few minutes, she finally opened her mouth. "Fumfaru Shiro?" He couldn't help but feel speechless at her attempt, and he said, "You should just call me Guinevere." "Okay, Guinevere," she replied with enthusiasm. It was clear that she was relieved to be able to address him as Guinevere. He wondered if it was because she was an actual human being and not a servant directly endowed with modern knowledge by the Holy Grail. For Artoria, who was accustomed to speaking Old English, speaking the Japanese language of Fujimaru Shirou was like asking a foreigner to speak a regional dialect they weren't familiar with. "Guinevere, I'm going to train with Hector now. Let's catch up over lunch." "Okay, sounds good. I have to go to work anyway," Shirou replied before leaving the manor. After bidding farewell to Artoria, Shirou followed the servants up the hill where they tended to the crops, weeding and fertilizing as they went. It had been a year since Shirou found himself in this world, taken in by the three individuals who saved him and brought him to the manor. During his time there, Shirou had focused on recovering his magical energy by absorbing human malice, learning the language, gathering information, and trying to confirm his whereabouts. He had made steady progress and had gained a good understanding of the world based on the knowledge he had accumulated over the past year. It was almost certain that Shirou had been thrown into the time of King Arthur in 5th century Britain after passing through the route. It was evident by the old knight, Hector, who was the foster father of King Arthur, the blonde girl, Artoria, with whom Shirou had fought in the Fourth Holy Grail War, and the boy, Kay, who would later become the third seat of the Knights of Round Table. However, at this point in time, Artoria had not yet pulled the sword from the stone and become King Arthur. She was still a young and inexperienced knight, staying with Hector. This was the extent of the information Shirou had been able to gather over the past year, which unfortunately was very little. It had taken Shirou an entire year to learn the language of Old Britain, a daunting task for a complete novice. The language was filled with unclear expressions and was far more difficult than modern English, making it a significant challenge for modern people to learn without a translation, teacher, or textbook. Shirou had no other option but to rely on his own efforts to learn Old British. He used the most brainless and arduous method, memorizing each word one by one. It took him a year to learn the vocabulary and grammar, but he still couldn't use it proficiently as the ancient language had limited expressive ability. However, he could communicate normally with enough effort. It was through this method that he obtained information about King Arthur. His purpose for gathering this information was to understand the world he was in and find a way back to his own time. A year had passed since he arrived in this world, and his desire to return home had only grown stronger. He couldn't shake the thought of his home in Fuyuki City. He had to go back, no matter what. The one problem that continued to trouble Shirou was the fact that he had entered this world through the root, and the only way back was to re-enter it. However, without the same level of power as Archiid, he couldn't possibly survive there. What's more, he had no idea how to open the root and return to his own world. To make matters worse, his contact with Scathach seemed to have been cut off. He had been unable to connect to the dream realm, the land of shadows, no matter how he slept this past year. It was as if he was blocked. After pulling out weeds from the fields, Shirou wiped the sweat off his forehead and contemplated his situation. Undoubtedly, the only way for him to return home at the moment was to find Merlin. Merlin was a famous magus in the legends of King Arthur and the entire world. He was a hybrid of incubus and humans, and had made many prophecies that had come true. Additionally, he was one of the strong candidates for the caster class, and possessed the clairvoyant skill which allowed him to see through the present. Ignoring his character, his abilities alone were impressive. If Shirou could find him, he might be able to get some advice even if there was no way to send himself back, provided that Merlin was willing to help him. As Shirou did not belong in this time period, Merlin, with his clairvoyance, should be able to sense that he was an outsider and come to him to inquire about it, just like Scathach did through the dream world. As a child of an incubus and a human, Merlin could easily use such a method to communicate in the dream. Despite waiting for a year, Merlin never came to him. It seemed as though he had not even noticed that Shirou was an outsider. This was simply unbelievable. Perhaps the Magus of Flowers had his own considerations. However, Shirou could not wait any longer. He had been away from his family for a year, and he was worried about them. Having learned to communicate in Old British, he decided to confront Merlin. Merlin was elusive, and unless he wanted to appear, there was no way to find him. But that did not matter because there was one place he would definitely go to every day: Artoria's dream. 15 years ago, the Western Roman Empire was in turmoil. Vortigern, a petty king, betrayed the kings of Britain and led the Anglo-Saxons to attack Britain. Uther Pendragon, who held the power of Britain, clashed against Vortigern but was defeated in the north. He had no choice but to place Britain's hope on the next generation of kings. Uther and Merlin, who was the court magus at the time, planned to create a new king who was born to be superior to ordinary humans and a container for the ideal king. They mixed the blood of the kings of Britain, the ideological consciousness of Britain's embodiment, the Red Dragon, and the noble female lineage of Igraine to perfectly merge the two. This was the background of Artoria Pendragon's birth. Artoria was created as a vessel for the king from the very beginning. However, the plan had a fatal flaw that could not be fixed. Artoria was a female, not a male. Females couldn't directly inherit the throne. To avoid the attention of others during her growth period, Merlin took her to the estate of the old knight, Ector, when she was about 5 years old. This was the same estate where Shirou was currently located. Artoria lived a humble life in Ector's estate as a trainee knight, training in swordsmanship and etiquette under Ector, while also participating in farming with her father and brothers. Most of Artoria's day was spent on her education as a future king. Even during her only 3 hours of sleep each day, Merlin entered her dreams to instill her with the teachings of a king. The days of endless and arduous study and training never had a moment of rest. After Shirou learned Old British, he advised Artoria to take more rest, but unfortunately, She knew that she was born for the purpose of the king plan, so the effect was not significant. Now, for his journey home, he had to confront Merlin. After finishing weeding, he returned to the manor where the cook had prepared lunch. A bowl of porridge made from buckwheat, not wheat or rice. Shirou spotted Artoria, who was hastily stuffing food into her mouth. He approached her and said, "Artoria, I could use your help with something." Upon hearing his request, she looked up, her blue eyes growing serious. "If something is troubling you, please don't hesitate to tell me. Genevieve, I'll do whatever I can to assist you. But it's not about giving up my food, is it?" He chuckled. "Don't worry. I won't steal your food." To be honest, the food of ancient Britain was unappetizing for modern people, lacking seasoning and flavor. He managed to eat enough to fill his stomach, but just barely. Despite his thoughts on the food, Shirou knew he had to focus on his request. "The thing is," he paused for a moment, "I was wondering if you could ask Merlin to appear in my dream tonight. There's something important I need to discuss with him." "Merlin." Artoria paused briefly, considering Shirou's request. "I'll let him know what you've asked for. However, I cannot guarantee that he will appear in your dream." "Huh, that's all right," Shirou replied. "I would appreciate it if you could at least ask him for me." As he made his way towards the door, a hand suddenly reached out from behind and grabbed his neck. Without skipping a beat, Shirou spoke up. "Kay, let go. You're making me uncomfortable." Kay, who had grabbed him, looked confused. "Hey, what makes you so sure it's me?" He chuckled and removed Kay's hand from his neck, turning to face him. "Because you responded. That's how I knew it was you." Kay took a moment to process Shirou's response, scratching the back of his head in mild distress. "Genevieve, you sly guy. You got me good." Shirou smiled. "Well, next time you decide to play a game like this, just make sure you don't give yourself away so easily." Kay was one of the 3 individuals who saved Shirou from danger a year ago. He was the biological son of the old knight Hector and would later become one of the esteemed knights of the Round Table. Initially, Shirou had trouble getting along with Kay. However, as they got to know each other better over time, he realized that Kay was actually quite easy to get along with, provided he could tolerate his foul mouth. Shirou had a high level of tolerance towards others' shitey personalities, and he knew how to use language to steer them in positive directions. It didn't take him long to become friends with Kay once he had mastered the Old British language. Despite Kay's tendency to use foul language, Shirou found that he could handle it easily, especially since Kay's level of profanity was nothing compared to that of a certain king of Uruk. "What can I do for you?" Shirou asked. "Don't flatter yourself." "Why would I need your help?" Kay retorted. Shirou smiled. "Because your expression says otherwise." Kay chuckled and scratched the back of his head. "You're perceptive, I'll give you that. The estate has to pay taxes, but there's too much money for me to handle alone. Can you assist me with it?" He raised an eyebrow. "Why don't you ask someone else for help?" Kay groaned in response. "They're so dull and boring." Shirou chuckled, gesturing towards Artoria, who was eating nearby. "Are they really that bad?" Kay let out a deep sigh, realizing he couldn't hide anything from Shirou. He turned to Artoria and said, "Art, let's go pay taxes together." "What?" Artoria looked up, looking troubled. "But brother, I still have to train in riding and swordsmanship this afternoon." Kay scratched his head. As Artoria's foster brother and Hector's biological son, he was well aware of Artoria's background. She was the child of Uther Pendragon and was created to be a vessel for the ideal king. Despite her exhausting training in swordsmanship under her foster father, Artoria worked tirelessly every day. Even her 3 hours of rest time were taken up by Merlin, who taught her knowledge of the king in her dreams. Kay knew that Artoria was created as a vessel for the ideal king, and he felt powerless to change this fact. However, he also wanted Artoria to take a break and relax, even though he wasn't sure how to persuade his serious and focused sister to unwind. Out of nowhere, Shirou reached for the bag of money beside Kay. He averted his gaze, deliberately avoiding Artoria's stare, and turned to Kay. "Let's go. I heard that the kingdom's tax policies have changed this year. It's a good opportunity to check them out, as the accuracy of tax policy is a key factor in determining a king's competence." Kay looked at Shirou in confusion, wondering why he brought up taxes at that particular moment. Before he could respond, Artoria slammed her bowl on the table and stood up, saying firmly, "I'm coming with you." Kay was momentarily stunned, unable to comprehend why his sister, who was notoriously difficult to persuade, had suddenly changed her mind so quickly. He turned to Shirou, who had a sly grin on his face. In an instant, he realized that his little sister had fallen for Shirou's trick.